Hello, everyone. I hope you're as happy to be here as I am. Last week, we went over some essentials of organic gardening, about building and maintaining soil, some details on how to make compost, some other agricultural information. And we saw what I think most people consider to be a really dynamic film, judging by the comments, the feedback that we've been getting. And I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about what plants need in order to thrive, so that you'll know specifically what to do when you go out into the garden. Excuse me. Of course, I have no way of knowing how many of you are experienced gardeners or novice gardeners or just beginning. So I'm going to quickly go through how to start a garden. If you have a patch of land, of ground in your yard, you are thinking of making a garden, one of the first things that you've got to do is you've got to locate a sunny spot. Vegetables to make fruit require a lot of sun. So you have to find a sunny spot in your yard. And then if there's any plants or grass or something growing, you need to remove that. And you just chop it down with a grape hoe or some kind of a hoe to maybe take away a 1-inch layer, which will take away most of the roots of the grasses and other plants that are there. And put that stuff, of course, onto your compost pile. And then you're ready to begin to create wholesome soil that will support the plants that you want to grow as your vegetables. And that means basically, as I said, the first class, adding soil amendments. It's important to amend the soil with substances that the plants require. You might say food for the plants. So you've got to make a dining table for the plants. And you do that by adding compost to your garden patch, also some peat moss, some manure. Remember, with the manure, it has to be dried manure, old manure. Something from the sea. My recommendation is kelp, and a substance called biochar. Very, very powerful plant-supporting substance. And depending on the results of the soil test, I forgot to say, first you should get a soil test. I'll talk about that in a second. You might have to add lime to the ground to make it the proper pH that your plants need. Scalp away the grasses. Now you've got pretty much bare ground. The first thing to do is to take a soil test. And the way you do that is you take start with the 4 corners of your garden. You have to imagine this. And dig a hole about 6 inches deep, like dig 1 shovelful down. And in that 6 inch, dig out with your trowel, dig out a scoopful of dirt. The idea is you don't want to take the dirt from the very top of your garden soil, because that's not where the roots of the plants grow. The roots of the plants grow down. So if you scoop away 1 shovelful, like 6 inches, and then you take the soil and test it about 6 or 10 inches below the top of the ground, that's when you're going to find the soil that's in the root zone of your plants. And that's the information that you need. Take that scoop from the 4 corners of your garden. And then if your garden is not too big, from the center, take a 5th scoop from the center of your garden. And if your garden is quite extensive, keep taking from the center of the garden or the midpoints of the garden if it has long edges. And you take those scoops as you're taking them, you just put them in a little bucket. You carry the bucket around with you, and you take a scoop of dirt, throw it in the bucket. Take a next scoop of dirt, throw it in the bucket. After you get your samples from your garden, then you mix them up in the bucket. Mix everything up so that you have one solid conglomeration of soil from 6 or 7 different locations. What you do with that soil that you've collected is you take a scoop out of the bucket that has been all mixed up already, take a scoop, put it into some sort of a waterproof container. What I use are these plastic refrigerator bags. They're perfect. You know, they hold it, they're watertight, they're waterproof. So you take a scoop from your bucket of mixed soil and you put it into a plastic bag. And you take a second scoop from your mixed bucket and you put it also into the plastic bag. So you've got a couple of scoopfuls of dirt in your plastic bag, something like the size of a loaf of bread, say, a small loaf of bread. And seal up the bag, close it up tight, put the plastic bag that has the soil in it into a cardboard box, and you seal up the box and you put it in the mail. You address the box to the place where the soil testing laboratory is. Traditionally, we've been using the lab at UNH. They have an excellent soil testing facility. With the COVID, they're on again, off again. So I don't know how dependable they'll be as a source.
They're on again.
They're on again? Okay,
you can't
good.
Go to the facility, but you can mail stuff.
Good. Okay, so you can use the address for UNH. What will happen is they will analyze that soil and they will send you back in the mail a week or 2 later a report on your soil, and they will detail the pH, the amount of acidity you have in the soil, and they will make a recommendation for you. If the soil is too acid, they'll suggest that you add some lime to the soil, and lime will neutralize the acidity. If the soil does not have enough acid, it's too basic, they'll suggest that you put a sulfur compound in to make the soil a little more acidic. So they not only give you the results of the chemistry of your soil, they also make recommendations to you as to what you can do to amend the soil, to ameliorate the condition of the soil, to make it more ideal for vegetable plants to grow. Once you've got that information, now you're ready to actually plant a garden. You cut the grass away, you took your sample, you've graded out the ground. Now, make the ground level, quite level, to form a seed bed. The soil has to be loosened up. You do that with a rototiller or with a pitchfork or whatever you want to loosen up the soil so you can rake it out into what will become a seed bed. The next thing you need to do is step back from your garden. Put the tools down and think. You've got to plan out the garden, what plants you're going to plant and where you're going to locate them. One of the primary things that you have to consider when you make these decisions is, where is the sun coming from? And you want to know that because as the sun shines on the plants will create a shadow. And you want to make sure that as the sun shines on your garden, the tall plants are not shadowing out the small plants. So you have to figure that out as far as where you're going to locate which plants. The tall growing plants, your tomatoes or your pole beans, you put those as far away from the sunny side of the garden as you can. And when they make their shadow, it will go on a place of your property that's not in the garden. And then you put your smaller plants closer and closer to where the sun begins. Now, what to plant? Obviously, you're going to plant the vegetables that you want to grow. But if you do a little bit of research before time, you can learn that there are certain plants which are friendly to each other and which support each other's growth. The terminology that we use is these are companion plants. They're plants that like each other and that support each other's growth. The traditional thing, you know, with the Indians, they used to plant corn and pole beans and squash all together because those three plants were friendly with each other and benefited each other. And that's exactly the same thing that organic gardeners do today. You try to find friendly companions and you plant them close to each other. Included in that concept and that construct is there are things other than vegetable plants which are friendly in the garden. So there are some herbs, for instance. And an example of that would be tomato plants very much like to be surrounded by basil. Basil and tomatoes are friendly companions. There are other examples too. There are charts that are available. As a matter of fact, even in the book I wrote and mentioned last time, I have 3-page charts of plant companions, which plants like each other and which plants hate each other. So that'll give you some guidance as far as how to enhance the garden by companioning. And that concept also applies to flowers. There are some flowers which are very friendly towards plants. And friendly means they could be reactive plants in 2 ways. Number one, they can be insect repellents. There are some flowers that repel certain insects, which would attack your garden plants, your vegetables. There are certain flowers which attract insects that eat the insects that eat your plants. So you have predator plants and you have supportive plants. And you can, all of this stuff is available. Like I said, it's all in the book I wrote. It's all in a lot of garden books. It's common, it's ordinary, but it is important. It's important to maximize the return you get from your garden and the level of enjoyment you're going to get out of doing the gardening. So it's worth considering these things that I'm mentioning to you. It's a lot more involved than just digging a hole and throwing a seed in. Speaking of digging a hole and throwing a seed, let's talk for a little bit about starting plants from seeds. One way you can grow plants is to get a container. And when I say a container, I mean any kind of a tray. It can be, for instance, the tray that a dozen eggs are packed in. That tray has separate compartments for the eggs. All you do is fill up those compartments with garden soil and plant seeds, 2 seeds in each little section. And then you just give it light and water and keep it warm. And those seeds will germinate and you'll get plants. There are plastic trays. That's what I used to use in my garden that hold 36 compartments, like the egg carton, but 36 of them. And I'd fill it up with seed starting mix and then put a couple of seeds in each hole and just keep it warm, give it light and water, and they grow. Um, it's easy and sensible, in my opinion, to use a commercial seed starting mix. Don't just take some dirt from your garden and throw it in the container and use that to put your seeds in. The commercial seed starting mixes contain all of the complements and the amendments that benefit soil, and plus it has some additional substances which seedlings benefit from. So my recommendation would be, don't try to reinvent the wheel. Just get a commercial seed starting mix, and they're readily available and they're not tremendously expensive. Okay, we spoke about that. And as far as planting the seeds go, it's important to follow the directions on the seed packet. They tell you how deep to plant the seeds. They tell you what time of the season to plant the seeds. Some seeds can be planted in cold weather. For instance, you can plant peas and beets and onions as soon as the ground softens up from the winter frost. As soon as the frost goes away, those seeds love the cold. They thrive in the cold. And you can plant those directly into the ground. Other seeds will just die if you put them in. They need much warmer soil temperature. It's all indicated, almost all of this information is indicated on the packet of seeds when you buy it. It tells you what temperature, how much sunlight they need, and so forth. So pay attention to that when you do your actual planting. Okay, so I taught you about making decisions on what crops to plant. Of course, what crops you like, what crops you want to eat. During the garden season, just to interject, there are other things you're going to need to do. You'll need to tie up the plants if they grow too big. You'll need to fertilize them periodically. You'll need to do the harvest and weeding. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these things tonight. Starting with plants from seeds.
We did have a question that, I'm sorry, John, I missed a question right at the beginning. But he asked, going back to the soil tests, he asked if the at-home soil tests are reliable, or should you be sending them to the UNH one? Is that a better idea?
I would put my confidence in the professional soil testing laboratories. UNH is only one. There are private businesses that do that. And I think those people have the technical expertise to make the complete analysis and to give you not only the results of the analysis, but recommendations as to what you should do to improve the soil so it will support your plants better. So I think you definitely should use a professional soil analysis service.
But don't depend on one that just has like
No,
a
not the thing from,
okay.
I've got no confidence in those things. They tell you that you're supposed to do it yourself. I don't think you get enough information from them, and there's no comparison with the quality. So thank you for that question. I've never used those individual do-it-yourself seed testing things, so that's why I didn't spend any time on it.
And then we have another question. Also, for anyone that's interested and wants to get it done through UNH, I've done the UNH soil testing. It's super easy. It's not even that expensive. But Sean posted the link to get your soil tested in the chat. I don't know if everyone can see it, but if they can't, I will submit it again because that may have accidentally just sent it to all the panelists. So I'll submit that again. But James is also is asking, how many hours of sunlight should the garden be getting per day?
Okay. The answer is the garden should get full sun all day long. That's the ideal. If the garden does not get at least 6 hours of sunlight, the plants are not going to make a lot of fruit. The plants will grow, but for the plants to give fruit, they need sun, and the more sun, the better. So I would say, if you can't give your plants at least 6 hours of good, strong sunlight, you're not going to have a very successful vegetable crop. I want to talk with you about starting plants from seeds. It's helpful if you understand that there are a few different kinds of seeds. One kind of seed is called open pollinated. It's a type of seed which is made, which we commonly think of. You get your vegetable plant, your tomato plant grows. You open up the fruit, and there are a bunch of seeds. And you dry those seeds out, and you save them, and you plant them the next year, and they give you a new tomato plant. Those are called open pollinated seeds. That's the way they grow. There are lots of vegetables, ordinary type vegetables, that grow that way and can be seeded that way. There's a favorite kind of open pollinated seed. An open pollinated seed that comes from a plant which has been so successful and so satisfactory to gardeners that it's been utilized for 50 years or for 80 years. That class of plants are called heirloom varieties. And all the vegetables have, almost all have heirloom varieties that have been around for decades and giving very good, satisfactory results. Some people like to plant heirloom seeds for that reason. There's another kind of seed which is very common and very effective and used a lot in gardens, and they're called hybrid seeds. A hybrid seed is a seed that is made by matching two different varieties of the same plant. So this kind of tomato with that kind of tomato, you match them up, and they grow fruit, and those fruit make seeds, and the seeds that come from that match are called hybrid seeds. They're very common. They're used in almost all the vegetables. They're very effective. Hybrid seeds, as a matter of fact, tend to be even more productive and more dynamic than the ordinary open pollinated, as a general rule, not as a hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, you get dynamite results from hybrid seeds. But the drawback of hybrid seeds, of plants grown from hybrid seeds, is if you save the seeds from the hybrid plant, it will not give you the same plant when it grows. The seed does not follow the parent in a hybrid plant. Because there were two parents, the hybrid seed will not reproduce exactly what it started as. So if you want to use hybrid seeds, by all means, go ahead, do it. Just recognize that you're not going to be able to save the seed and replant it next year. And then there are some kind of specialized seeds. For instance, organic seeds. Organic seeds are grown according to principles of organic agriculture, which eliminates synthetic chemicals and other substances and practices. So the seed is of a different caliber or a different quality or different something. The organic seeds are different than commercially unorganic seeds. And another type of seed that's out on the market are these, what are called GMO seeds, genetically modified seeds. These are seeds that have been created in a laboratory. The GMO seeds did not come directly from a living plant. They came from a combination of plant material and synthetic chemicals in a laboratory. And it's a customized artificial product which will grow vegetables. And the reason they exist is a lot of times they have characteristics that people look for. For instance, sometimes they're more disease resistant. Sometimes they're more insect resistant. And they have some of those characteristics. At the same time, they're more vulnerable to legitimate criticism because and sometimes they don't support what you might think of as standard plant growth and plant production. It's customized, it's specialized, it's artificial. You get tomatoes from it, and the tomatoes are eligible to eat. They're not poison or anything. It's just that they're not, you might say, natural. Okay, now I want to talk with you a little bit about this. Okay, wait, I'm going to hold off on it for a second, but I'm going to get back to it because it's really important. So we got the soil test, and we did that laboratory. We got the results. Now, when you plant in the garden, either you're going to plant the seeds in seed trays and nurse them along in a greenhouse until they mature into seedlings, which you plant into the garden, or you're going to actually plant seedlings directly into the garden. You go to the garden center and you buy plants, and you take those plants and you stick them into the garden. Either way is fine. Either way works just great. You have more control of what you plant if you sort the seeds yourself. In the garden center, you don't have control of that. You just have a selection that they offer you. When you plant, this is really important. When you plant into your garden, particularly when you're getting the seedlings, not the seeds, the seedlings, the small plants into the garden, you dig a hole and you put the plant into the hole, but it's really desirable to add some living creatures to that hole. They're called fungi. Technically, they're called Mycorrhizoba fungi. And they are supporters of plants by attaching themselves to, these fungi are alive. They attach themselves to the roots of the plant, and they gather substances that plants need from the soil, and they bring those substances to the plant and insert those substances through the roots so the plant gets nourishment from these Mycorrhizoba fungi. You can buy Mycorrhizoba fungi. They're commonly for sale in garden centers. They look like a black powder. They are a black powder, except this black powder is full of living creatures. They're microscopic. You can't see them without a microscope, but they're microscopic. And their function is to enhance the performance of the plants in the way I described to you. They allow the plant to get food supplies from the soil that the plant would not be able to get otherwise if it didn't have those mycorrhizobials attached to its roots. So think of mycorrhizobial fungi as plant root extenders and plant root feeders. And the way you use them is two ways. When you take the seedling out of the tray, it has a root ball on the bottom, and you take the root ball and you rub it into the black powder, and then you take a little bit of the black powder and you throw it into the empty hole, and then you put the seedling into the hole that has some black powder in the bottom of it and some black powder attached to the roots. Then you just plant the plant, refill the hole and tamp it down a little bit, and that's all you do. You never see those microzobials, you never interact with them. They're not a part of your life anymore. All they are is a very valuable support system for the plants. You have to be careful when you buy mycorrhizobial, when you buy the black powder. The fungi have a life of about 2 years. The container that they sell the microbials in has a date on it. And God only knows why, but for some reason, some companies put the date the microzobials will die. Other companies, for some reason, put the date the microbials were made, when this product was produced. So if you get the one that has the date the product was produced, you're going to have 2 more years of living mycorrhizobials that you could use from that container. If you get the one that has the date the microbials will die, well, you got to pay attention to that date. If the microbials are dated to die in 3 months from now, all you're buying is a bag of black powder. So you have to be careful, and unfortunately in the industry, there's not a standard for that. So you're pretty much on your own. The guideline that I use is if the date is fairly close to today's date, I just assume, even within 6 months of today's date, I just assume it's getting to the end of its life and I don't buy it. And if I see a package that has a date very close to today's date, I assume it's newly made, and I'll buy that one. But you don't have any guidance. It's a screwed up system. Yeah, the microbials work on all the vegetables, but not on the brassicas family. You know, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, those brassicas vegetables, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, the microzobials, for some weird reason, don't affect them in any way. So it's a waste to put it there. I have no idea why that happens, but that is a fact. The other thing is, how do you plant the seeds or seedlings? It's common knowledge that you plant the seed, any plant with the top of the root ball, even with the top of the soil that you're planting it in. That's pretty much standard practice. And almost all of your vegetable plants get planted exactly that way, with one exception. Strange as it seems, tomatoes love to be planted much, much deeper than that. The tomato plant wants not only its root ball to be under the soil, but it wants inches and inches of its stem to be buried in the soil. And don't be afraid. That sounds against plant religion, but that's the way tomatoes work. And why that's helpful for tomatoes to plant them so deep is that stem that's in the ground develops roots, and the roots spread out not only from the root ball on the bottom, from all along the stem. So the tomato plant has a much better chance of thriving, finding water, finding food, to have all of that big root system working for it than just to have the little bit at the ball. So keep in mind, tomato plants go against everything you ever knew about plants, in that you almost want to bury them with just a little bit sticking out of the ground. The fact of the matter is, sometimes you can't dig a hole that's a foot deep to bury the tomato plants for whatever reason. And what's commonly done in that circumstance is the gardener digs a trench and lays the tomato plant down horizontally in the trench and covers the trench with dirt and just leaves the leafy top of the tomato plant above the ground. Sounds crazy, but that's the way it works. That's the nature of tomatoes. So that's how you do that for maximum production. You use some mycorrhizobal inoculants, and you plant everything with the inoculant. Oh, the other thing I need to tell you about the inoculant is this. Not only does it have a life of 2 years that you have to concern yourself with, but sunlight kills microrhizobials. So when you're working in the garden planting and you have your tray of mycorrhizobials, try your best not to expose that tray to the sun. And the way I do it in my garden is I've got a tray with black powder in it, and I take the black powder and I put it on my root ball. I take some of it, I throw it into the hole, and then I get another tray and I cover the black powder. So the black powder is not in the sun, it's in the shade. And I suggest that you do that, because sunshine will kill the microbials, and then you're going no place. Tomatoes. Another thing you're going to have if you buy plants from the store, seedlings from the store. A lot of times when you take that seedling out of the container, you'll find a whole tight-knit bunch of white roots going all everywhere in that root ball. That happens because the plant has been in the container too long and has gotten root bound, what you call root bound. It's not a serious problem. Believe it or not, you take the plant, you get a knife, and you cut the root ball like halfway up, and you cut it in half, or you even cut it in 4 sections. Don't cut it all the way up to the stem, just half of the root ball. Cut it and spread those sections out, and those roots will go into the ground and spread out and grow just fine. But they won't thrive too well if you just take it out of the container and take the root-bound ball and stick it in the ground. That you won't get such good results. So you cut it with the knife and spread them out and throw it in the hole. I can't emphasize the mycorrhizobal inoculant. Really beneficial, really, really beneficial. Watering. Let's talk a little bit about watering the plants. Once you got plants growing in your garden, of course, they need water. If your water comes from nature and rain, great. Most likely it won't. You won't get enough. So you have to water supplementally. There are a few techniques that you can use that are very effective in getting water on the plants. the one principle I want to try to start with is when you water your plants, it's a really good idea to try not to wet the leaves. When the leaves of the plant get wet, that moisture supports fungus growth, which helps to create plant diseases. So if you can keep those leaves dry by watering only the base of the plant, your plant will be much better off and much safer. Now you say, Vincent, I go out into my garden early in the morning. The whole plant is soaking wet from dew of the night. So what difference does it make if I throw some more water on? And I agree with you completely. It makes no difference at all under that circumstance. But keep in mind, the water that's on the plants from the dew will be gone in a matter of a couple of hours, and the leaves will be dry all day long. So if you can water your plants early in the morning and you get water on the leaves along with the dew, it doesn't matter one bit. But if the leaves on your plants are already dry from the morning dew, it's really a good idea not to wet them again during the day. The wetter you make the leaves, the more you're encouraging disease to come. Root-bound inoculant, watering or keep the leaves dry. Now, there are a few ways to water the plants. And obviously, from what I just said, the one way that's not a good advice on watering plants is that overhead lawn sprinkler that goes like this, back and forth, and waters everything. It's simple, it's easy, and it makes the whole entire plant wet, and therefore is not desirable. Much more desirable than that is a couple of products. Just like you could buy the sprinkler, you can buy something called a soaker hose. A soaker hose is a length of hose, 50 foot or 100 foot long. And that length of hose is full of holes, tiny little holes that you can't see. But if you put water into a soaker hose, the whole entire hose will leak water out. And that's wonderful to put that soaker hose at the base of your plants. Just run the soaker hose down the row of your garden where you put your plants, and pump water into the soaker hose, and the soaker hose will water your plants without watering the leaves. Sometimes some of the holes in the soaker hose make the water go up because those holes are on top of the hose. So what happens is now the soaker hose starts to water the leaves of your plant. Oh my God, my leaves are getting watered from the soaker hose. So what are you going to do? I mean, for me, I go to extremes. I pick up a nearby rock and I put it on top of the hole, and the water stops coming up to the leaves. You could do whatever you want, but it's a part of dealing with soaker hose. There's another type of a specialized type of a hose. It's called a drip line, a drip hose. This is a really ingenious idea. I take my hat off to the guy who figured it out. A drip hose is a hose like any other hose, except periodically there are some holes in the hose. Periodically means every 12 inches there's hole. Every 12 more inches there's more holes. 12 more inches there's more holes. Aside from those holes, water does not escape from a drip irrigation hose anywhere else. The water only comes out where those holes are, and those holes are mathematically spaced. Now, if you just think about that, wouldn't that be a nice thing to have by your lettuce plants, which you plant 12 inches apart? Every time there's a lettuce plant, put the drip hose there. And next lettuce plant, next drip hose. And you got a whole row of lettuce plants getting watered using really small amount of water and not watering the ground and nearby weeds, only specifically watering the plants. And those drip hoses come every 12 inches, every 15 inches, every 18 inches, every 24 inches. So you can customize a drip irrigation system. Very, very efficient, very effective. There's a very simple thing that you see in the garden centers a lot. It's a wand, a watering wand. It's an aluminum tube that's maybe 3 foot long or 4 foot long. At one end is a connection that you stick a hose in, and at the other end is a sprinkler head. And you connect the hose to the wand, turn the hose on, and water comes spraying out of the sprinkler head. And all you do is you walk with the wand by your side and you water the base of your plants, one after the other, after the other, after the other, and you just walk down the row of your garden, and only the base of the plants gets watered, and it gets watered as much as you want to water it. And it's tremendously efficient, also a tremendously efficient way to water your plants, except you've got to stand there and do it. You don't have to do that with soaker hose or with drip irrigation. But if it's a small enough garden, or if it's your pleasure, just use a wand. Water them with the wand. And this is very complicated. How do you know if the plants need water? Well, first of all, it's obvious when the plants are all wilted like this, like a weeping willow tree. I mean, man, you're doing a bad job gardening, because they should never get that dried out. That's the next step is tomorrow it's going to drop dead. So you're starving it to death from water. You can test. It's a little bit complicated and confusing, but you can test if the ground has enough water so the plants don't get to that extreme of drought. It's good to use your right hand. You take your right hand, you put it next to the base of the plant, and you take those fingers and you sort of jam them down into the ground. And you jam them down and you jam them down until that hand is covered with dirt. It's all the way in the dirt. And you see what your fingertips feel like. Do they feel warm and dry? Your plants are in danger of dying. There's no water. Do they feel damp? Do they feel cool, your fingertips? That's because there's water in the soil. You don't have to add more water. So you have this very expensive, very technical system for testing if your plants need water. Stick your damn hand in the ground and feel what it feels like. Okay, so that's that. We talked a little bit about using manures. And I got to say again, manure is a magnificent soil amendment, a great substance that supports plant life and plant health. You got to be careful because you only want to use aged manure. Fresh manure contains disease organisms that can cause disease. Let the fresh manure dry out a year later, 2 years later. Let it be dry, and then use it. You get all the benefits of your soil gets all the benefits of the manure, but you don't have the danger of the disease. And just for information, the way this happens is if you have manure in the soil And if the manure has these microorganisms that cause disease in humans, the way people get sick from that manure is if the fruit on the plant touches the manure. That's how the organism gets transferred from the diseased manure into the fruit of the vegetable plant, which is the part you're going to eat. And that's what makes people get sick. Salmonella, E. coli, these other foodborne diseases that come from manure. And it comes when the fruit of the plant touches the manure. So you can't let that happen. Only use dry manure to begin with, and those organisms are all dead already. You never have a problem. I had a big commercial garden for 13 years. I never had a single incident of anything like that. If you have food poisoning or something, you're doing something really wrong. You use the manure on the ground in the fall as a soil amendment. In the spring, once again, as a soil amendment. Fall is much better. I put down my manure and my other soil amendments in the fall, and then I put my cover crop right in, and I don't turn it into the ground at all. I want those amendments, especially the manure, to be out in October, in November, in December, in January, in February, in March, 6 months of sunshine and rain and snow and everything else to kill off any organisms that might be there. And that's what makes sense to me, and that's what I did, and I never had a problem with it. And I strongly recommend it.
We do have a question. So John is planning on building a raised bed on legs, and he said, would it be best to line the bottom with plastic, or would landscape fabric be a better option? And would you have a recommendation on where to buy good, clean soil to fill the bed?
John, I'm not quite clear on what you mean, a raised bed on legs. I've only seen familiar with raised beds that have solid sides on all four sides, but that's an aside. I would not recommend you use plastic as a liner. Plastic will accumulate moisture over and over and over again as the time goes by, as the season goes by. You're watering your garden, the rain is coming down, and the plastic is saving all of that water and accumulating it until it gets to a point where your plants are growing in mud. And that's really, really undesirable. So I think plastic is a really bad idea. The landscape fabric is a much better idea because that's porous. And water comes down from the rain or from your watering, and then it leaks out through the plastic, through the landscape fabric, and goes away. Fine. Don't use plastic, please.
And then do you have any recommendations of good, clean soil that he can use to fill the bed? Or like where you would get that?
There are a couple of thoughts that come to my mind that might help you, John. Number one, depending on how big the raised bed is, you might want to buy topsoil in bulk. You might want to buy a truckload of topsoil. Doesn't have to be a truckload, it could be a yard or 2 yards of soil from the garden center or 3 yards of soil. But what I'm saying is not in bags, loose topsoil. That would fill up your beds. But you still need to add the soil amendments. You need to add the compost. You need to add the cow manure. You need to add peat moss. You need to add the kelp from the sea. You need to add the biochar. You need to add all of those soil amendments into the topsoil that you filled up your bed with. So that's the answer to your question. I don't know if it's what you were expecting, but you asked, do I have a recommendation? Where to buy good, clean topsoil? I would suggest a local garden center. A lot of times the garden centers can sell large truckloads of soil depending on how much you need. In my garden, I used to buy truckloads of topsoil 10 yards, which is a big mountain of topsoil. In yours, I know the garden centers sometimes send out a small truck and they'll just deliver to your place 1 yard of soil. So I would suggest a local garden center and fill the bed with good topsoil and then add soil amendments to it. You'll have a beautiful garden.
So he said the bed will be 4 feet by 12 feet by 18 inches high.
So 12, 24, 36, that's 48 square feet. Multiplied again is 24, 48, 24, 48, 58, 68. That's about 70 square feet. 70 cubic feet. John, I can't give you an amount of I don't know how much water or things you need to fill that bed properly. I think if you did it the way I suggested, measure it up, you're going to need 70 cubic feet. You got to put that in cubic yards. 9 cubic yards is I don't know, 9 cubic feet is 1 cubic yard, 9, 18, 27, 36, 45, 46, 72. It might be 7 or 8 yards of material to fill that box. You have to do the math. But fill it with topsoil, add soil amendments, and have a great time planting your garden. Should work out wonderful. Put the bed in the sun. Get the bed in the sun. I hope that's helpful, John. That's the best I could do. Using manures, use manure in the garden, use it as a top dressing, use it on the compost pile. Manure is a wonderful thing. Just make sure you use aged manure. And the other caution I have on manure is this: don't use horse manure. Even though it's tempting because so much of it is available for free, horse manure is full of weeds. So you put horse manure down in your garden and you're planting a weed garden. I never, in all the years I did gardening and all the topsoil I used, I never ever went anywhere near horse manure. And for that reason, it's just loaded with weeds, and in my opinion, it's unsuitable for gardening. Is it time for the film?
Yes, are you ready for it?
Yeah, let's take a little break. I hope you enjoyed the film last week. This particular film is just so spectacular at portraying what's really going on with plants that I always included in my garden classes, because I think most people are not aware of these things. So these behaviors that plants have, many of them are defensive behaviors and some of them are enrichment behaviors. But go ahead, look at this one.
Knapweed has invaded some 4.5 million acres of Montana rangeland. And no one knows more about its aggressive behavior than plant ecologist Ray Calloway.
So JC, this is a pretty good example of a really dense knapweed monoculture. It's not a very big patch. So you notice it follows a road. Knapweed loves disturbance. Usually when you get something this dense, disturbance is a part of it. But there's nothing native in here. So this is maybe a little more typical of a spotted knapweed invasion. You know, there's a lot of knapweed, maybe it's more of it than anything else, but there's still a few natives left in here. I mean, this kind of scene covers a lot of Montana.
It's been neat and sort of sad to see this at the same time. this isn't just a plant that academics use to answer neat academic questions. This is a plant that is causing people hardship on the land.
But I would say again, this is a lot more typical.
So there's a huge drop in biodiversity that follows this invasion, and so these plants are just knocking off the natives.
Yeah.
So if knapweed is the plant equivalent of the Terminator, how does it wage war? Well, there may be a lot of factors giving this invader a leg up. But the root of the problem may quite literally be in the roots. To uptake essential soil nutrients, knapweed roots deploy a variety of chemicals. And when they're released, the chemicals have a nasty added benefit. They seem to kill off a lot of native grasses, allowing knapweed to capture and hold huge swaths of territory.
Invaders.
A behavior that's very animal-like.
Interestingly enough, this could be one neat behavioral sort of analogy with plants, holding a territory through the release of chemicals that harm your neighbors, and then making the resources that are there available to you. So JC, this experiment...
And experiments like this one show just how lethal those chemicals can be.
Competitive ability of this spotted knapweed.
Callaway planted native grass alone, and others in pots with knapweed. In the latter group, half the samples were treated with activated carbon, a substance that would neutralize at least some of the toxins released by the knapweed roots. The results are astonishing.
So these grasses that I'm showing you here were all planted at the same time. This was grown by itself, no big surprise, but it's huge. It doesn't have any competitors.
Nice happy plant.
Right? It's a nice happy plant, nothing affecting it. This one is growing with a knapweed, obviously, and then there's no activated carbon in the soil. So this plant is, 50 times smaller.
Knapweed is absolutely waging war with its neighbors, but it's doing it not just in the standard light and nutrient sort of way, it's also doing it with these chemical interactions in the soil, and so it's adding this whole new dimension. This chemical warfare is novel, and it has these abilities to kill the native plants, which is very rare among plant species.
But there's one native plant that can fight back. These colorful little flowers belong to the wild lupine, and lupines can launch a chemical counterattack of their own. Like their knapweed neighbors, lupine roots release a chemical called oxalic acid to get food from the soil. And amazingly, that chemical also acts as a defensive shield against the knapweed toxins. But these feisty little plants don't just defend themselves, they also seem to protect the plants around them.
My lab has shown in the field that not only does lupine seem to do well against knapweed, if we experimentally plant grasses near lupine in a knapweed patch, they do much better next to lupine. It's a really exciting thing to consider in terms of potential ways that plants may interact that really has not been explored. It's a totally behavioral sort of analogy.
So what does this complex behavior teach us about the social lives of plants? Well, when you look around at the incredible diversity of the plant world, you start to realize that knapweed's style of killer competition isn't the dominant form of social interaction among plants.
Is that it?
That's it, yeah.
Oh, shoot, there's much more to that story. Okay, we got the numbers screwed up.
Okay, well, can we summarize what it says basically?
Can I show, can we use the disc?
We can try. I don't know how that's gonna work. Hold on, everyone.
Talk to the people behind the issue.
Yeah, apparently our clip ended sooner than it should have. Let me see if I can get this. No, we're not gonna be able to do it.
Okay.
So you're just gonna have to summarize it for
Okay.
people.
Gee, I'm sorry about that mix up. I don't know how that happened, but I feel awful. You people got cheated out of a very, very dramatic thing. I have another piece of film to show next time. It's a little bit longer, but really, really valuable. It's a bringing it all together kind of a thing, which is really astonishing. I'll see if I can add the missing piece from this week's film to next week's film without taking up too much time. I don't know how we had this mix up, and I apologize for it. So let's move on. We didn't. Another important plant practice. We talked about making the garden. We talked about planting. We talked about watering. We talked about planting the garden, soil testing. I want to talk a little bit about fertilizing, which is an important part of vegetable growing. It's artificial in the sense that it's not the natural way plants grow, but it is very beneficial in that it supplements any deficiencies that might be in the plant's environments, so you end up with much more productive plants and overcoming any natural deficiencies that might exist. And the kind of fertilizer you should use is what's called a complete fertilizer: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, NPK. It's common on the bag. They're all arranged by the same number system, and nitrogen is the first number, phosphorus is the second number, potassium is the third number, and the bag says something like 5, 10, 5. And what that means is 5 parts nitrogen, 10 parts potassium, 10 parts phosphorus, and 5 parts potassium, NPK. So that's what's called a complete fertilizer. They're very common. They're all over the place. It's really ordinary in all the garden centers. There's nothing exotic or unusual about it. You try to harmonize with the soil test. So if the soil test comes back and tells you that your garden has too much phosphorus, just for argument's sake, you can buy a fertilizer that has a lot of nitrogen, a lot of potassium, and very little phosphorus. And that's what you should do in that circumstance. So you can manipulate the fertilizers that way. You just have to understand the formula. Like I said, first number is nitrogen, then phosphorus, then potassium, NPK. There's another product that I really, really, really want you to use because it's so great. It's called Compost Tea. Compost Tea is a literal description of what this is. This is a substance that you make yourself, and you make it from your compost pile. So you get some kind of a net bag or a mesh bag, like an onion bag or some other thing that will let seepage through the bag, not a plastic bag. So you get a mesh bag, you get a appropriate amount of water. If you have an enormous garden, you might want a 55-gallon drum of water. If you have a smaller garden, you might want a 5-pound bucket, you know, that small 5-gallon, not pound, 5-gallon bucket. But whatever quantity of substance you want to satisfy your plant's needs, you just fill it with water, and you put the literal compost. You take the compost with your hand and put it into this mesh bag. And then you take the mesh bag, you tie it up at the top, so you close it, and you take the mesh bag and you put it into the bucket or the barrel of water. You can tell where I'm going, right? I said compost tea. So you get the compost into the water, and all you have to do is stir it around. If you got a little bucket of water, you get a stick and you stir it around a little bit. And if you got a big barrel, you know, you get a canoe paddle and you stir it around, you know, 66 turns to the right and 66 turns to the left, and you stir it around. And you're brewing compost tea. After a day or two, you'll have compost tea. It will leach out of the bag. The compost dynamic components of the compost will leach out of the bag, go into the water, and you will now have a brew of compost tea. What you do with that compost tea is you put it into a watering can and you water your plants with it. You water the leaves, even though I just told you before to keep the leaves dry. Now you're feeding the plant, and through the bottom side of the leaves, through the stomates, the plant absorbs these fertilizers that come from the compost tea. So you want to wet the leaves with the compost tea, and you want to wet the soil with a soil drench. So the compost tea goes down to the roots, and the roots absorb it. And that's a compost tea fertilizing. You make it, it doesn't cost you anything, you do a little bit of work, and it is sensational for your plants. That's part one of the fertilizer program. Part two of the fertilizer program is a product from the sea. A lot of plant nutrients come from the sea, from the sea water and from the sea weeds, the sea plants. So you get a sea product. This is a commercial product that you buy. It's a processed product. It's called fish emulsion. And it's an emulsion of it comes from the factories where they process fish. The waste product from the processing, they emulsify it. And they put it into a suspension in a liquid, and it's called fish emulsion. And they sell it by the gallon or by the 5-gallon pail or whatever's suitable for your size garden. And you take this fish emulsion and you mix it with water appropriately, and you do exactly the same thing with the fish emulsion. Pour it out of your can, wet the leaves with it, pour it out of the can, wet the ground with it, saturate the soil so the roots get the fish emulsion. And you do fish emulsion today, 1 week later you do compost tea. 1 week later you do fish emulsion. No, 2 weeks later. You do fish emulsion, 2 weeks later, compost tea. So you're alternating between the compost tea and the fish emulsion. And that's your fertilizer program. That's all you need to fertilize your plants. And believe me, your plants will be happy, happy, happy. It's wonderful plant food. You do it yourself, and that's how you use it. That's how you make it. That's how you use it. Fish emulsion, compost tea, every 2 weeks. I said week. I made a mistake. It's every 2 weeks. You do one week, you do fish emulsion. 2 weeks later, you do compost tea. 2 weeks later, you do fish emulsion. 2 weeks later, and you do it all season long. That's the only fertilizer you put on your plants. You can't do better. You can't make better fertilizer than that for plants. Okay, so manures. Okay, now, other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is the harvesting. The harvesting is pretty obvious. I'm going to give you a planting technique that I use, and that makes a great deal of sense. I spoke with you about these drip hoses that periodically have holes to put water. Well, I use the same technique when I plant certain plants, and I recommend it to you. I'm going to plant lettuce plants 12 inches apart. 12 inches apart lettuce plants, okay? I plant them. In between every lettuce plant, I put lettuce seeds. And between the next 2 lettuce plants, I put lettuce seeds. And between the next 2 lettuce plants, I put lettuce seeds. And what am I doing? I am allowing the lettuce plants to grow and to mature, and I'm going to harvest them and cut them down and take them away, by which time the lettuce seeds that I planted will also have germinated and have begun to grow. And as I'm taking the mature lettuce plants out of the garden, the seeds are springing up, giving me new lettuce plants. And it's simple. It's totally simple. And you can use that technique with some other vegetables also. But it's a way of harvesting, and a way of planting and harvesting. It's a scheduled plant thing. The other thing that you might want to try, and it's a good idea, it works well also, when you get your plants at maturity and they're ready to be harvested, instead of cutting them down at the base and taking the whole plant like you generally do with lettuce, take only the big mature leaves and leave the immature leaves on the plant. So the plant is still alive, still growing, and still giving you more vegetable, more fruit, not more fruit, more leaves usually. As you're harvesting the mature leaves, and you're allowing the immature leaves to generate and regrow. So the same plant, you might harvest 2 or 3 times during the garden season, just by not pulling it all out. Just take the largest, most mature leaves, leave the immature leaves, and let them grow. A lot of plants work really well that way. Let's finish with the garden. The garden season ends. We take all the plants out of the garden. You know, they're not producing anymore. The life is used up. So the thing to do is to take all the plants, and the used up plants, and the residue that has accumulated in the garden, and remove it. You want the garden, what used to be the garden, you want the garden site to be clean dirt. A lot of damaging insects and organisms live among the debris of plants. And that's why you clean everything out of your garden. You don't want to give a home to undesirable or harmful insects or disease organisms. So you clean that out. Now, this is a little bit funny. My grandpa had a garden. My dad had a garden. I always had a garden. we were so proud at the end of the season that our garden was nice and clean, and all winter long we looked at that garden space and smiled, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. My grandpa was wrong, and my dad was wrong, and I was wrong. And I'm going to help you not to be wrong. If you just think about it, nature in the natural world never leaves naked ground. If you have earth, if you have soil, nature always allows plants to grow. If the plants are trees or if the plants are what we call weeds, but something is always growing in the soil. That's nature's way. Unless you have ground that will not support plant life, for instance, the beach. You can't grow vegetables on the beach. It's all sand. There's no nutrients there. But if you have soil that I've showed you how to make and how to create, that soil will support additional crops over the winter. Not vegetables, not crops for you to eat, but crops to feed the soil and to build up the soil, to get it ready for next year's garden. That's the smart thing to do. And that process is called a cover crop. You plant a cover crop. The cover crop is a combination of grasses and legumes, and also daikon radishes. Grasses, not the kind of grass you grow in the lawn, the kind of grass the farmer grows out in the field that goes 3 feet high. You grow grasses, ryegrass, buckwheat, oats, those kind of grasses. And you intermix with those grasses in a seed mixture, legumes, peas, beans, alfalfa, vetch, those kind of plants fall into the group called legumes, which means plants that deposit nitrogen in the soil. The way they live is to go through the life processes which include depositing nitrogen in the soil. So the legumes in your cover crop are fertilizing your ground. That's why you use them. You use the grasses, you use the legumes, and there's one other thing you use in a cover crop mix, and it's called Daikon radishes. Daikon radishes are edible, but the reason why you put them in a cover crop is because Daikon radishes grow with a root about 2 feet deep. The white Daikon radishes penetrate the soil, allow air to enter, and extract from the soil substances that are desirable to bring up to the top. So grasses, legumes, Daikon radishes. That's your cover crop. You plant that when your garden is all harvested. It's finished for the season. Plant these. Many of them will survive the winter. Many of them will even grow through the winter. They're cold hardy. Some of them won't grow through the winter, but they will survive the winter. And then others of the grasses, oats, for instance, they will just die when it gets that cold. But that's okay, because they're dying in your garden and they still are food for the plants. Because what you do in the springtime with this cover crop, that's all over the place, you wait for the legumes to make their flowers. When they make their flowers, that's when the nitrogen goes into the soil. Let them finish making the flowers, and then you chop everything down. go with a weed whacker or go with a hoe or a knife or anything. You chop all the cover crop to the ground, and it just lays there for a short time, because you're going to come immediately or soon, very soon, in a matter of a day or two, with a rototiller, and you're going to rototill everything into the soil. And the soil already has nitrogen coming in from the legumes. Now the soil is going to have food for the organisms. All those grasses feed, become organism food, bug food, microbe food. You're enriching the soil by making it a more wholesome, supportive soil for the living organisms in the soil, whether they're big enough to see or not. That's what the cover crop does for you, and that's why it's important. The Daikon radishes get the air way down in there, the legumes put nitrogen, and the grasses give biomass. They call that biomass, food for the living organisms in the soil. Yeah, rototill it all in. I used to rototill spring and fall. At the end of the season, I would rototill a garden, but I stopped doing that because it was too much rototilling. I didn't want to go completely to no-till because I wasn't mechanized and I didn't use chemicals. And no-till encourages a lot of weed growth, or allows a lot of weed growth, and I couldn't deal with that. So I rototill in the spring immediately after I cut down my cover crop and before I planted my garden. So that was the compromise that I made. I rototilled once a year, and I always rototilled once a year. I did not do no-till, although it's very fashionable nowadays to do no-till with a cover crop mulch, but I didn't use that system. What else? We spoke about companions, anti-companions. Oh, trap crops. Certain bugs like certain crops. Certain bugs like certain crops better than they like other crops. So, for instance, if you plant squash, you're very likely to meet up with a bug that loves squash, called the striped squash borer. They love squash. And they become a pest in your garden, attacking your squash plants. I had that problem. And I found out about blue Hubbard squash. Blue Hubbard squash are humongous. They're like 2 feet in diameter or more. They're round, big, which made the whole idea very impractical to me because I wasn't about to wrestle with that. But there's something called baby blue Hubbard squash. And baby blue Hubbard squash comes out like the size of a cantaloupe, big cantaloupe. And why do I give a damn about blue Hubbard squash? But because the striped squash borer loves blue Hubbard squash. It loves blue Hubbard squash more than it likes squash. You get where I'm going? So I put my blue Hubbard squash here, and I put my garden squash here. And I put some blue Hubbard squash here and some garden squash here. And when the bugs came, of course, they went to the blue Hubbard squash, which they loved, and which I didn't give a damn about. It wasn't important to me. But they left my other squash alone, and my squash garden was clean and fine and profitable. That's an example of a trap crop. You use a crop to protect a different crop from invasion from insects. Very effective technique. You have to research it, find out what are the traps for which crops, but it works. It worked magic for me, and it'll work for anybody. It's just another technique for knowledgeable gardeners. Remember, a big problem with gardens are pests. Philosophically, I reject the concept of killing the pest, because in killing the pest, you necessarily kill a lot of things that you don't want to kill. And you poison other things, like the vegetables you eat. So I don't go with the chemical control system at all. But there are other control systems. I gave you one, which is a trap crop system. There are biological controls in addition to trap cropping. For instance, there are certain herbs which attract certain insects. And interestingly enough, if you design it right, the insects that get attracted to these herbs are the insects that eat the bugs that eat your plants. So obviously you want a lot of these herbs in your garden. They're protecting your desirable plants by killing off the predators. The very same thing is true with flowers. Certain flowers attract certain insects which are predators to the undesirable insects. So you could use herbs and you could use flowers to bring in an insect army to attack the bugs that would ordinarily bother your plants. It works, it's effective, and it's not poisonous to anything. Not to the animals, not to the ground, not to your kids, not to you, and not to anybody who eats the food from your garden. The other aspect of this, it takes us back to companion planting. There are some plants which don't attract predators to kill other bugs, but they attract pollinators, especially flowers. They attract pollinators that go flying all around your garden, feeding all the plants the nectar that they gather as they go around. That's what bees do. Bees are pollinators. There are a lot of other pollinator critters out there, and you can use those in a systematic garden plan to help control insects. No pesticides. There are predators that you could bring into your garden. These are, I guess it's good to consider them insects. Insects that eat the bugs that eat your plant. You know, we talk about the praying mantids, the ladybugs, the things like that. Those two are not terribly efficient. The predators, because the praying mantids, because they're too fussy, they don't eat enough stuff. And the ladybugs, because they're not dependable. They eat over here today, and then tomorrow they fly away, then they're gone. So it doesn't work. But there are other predators that you can buy commercially, readily available. There's nothing mysterious about it. And they live in your garden and they eat garden pests. That's their food. So if you wanna be clean and avoid poisons for your family and for yourself, there are tools that you can use, companions and others. This, I got a dramatic demonstration of this when I first started teaching this course 10 years ago, 15 years ago. At the end of one of the classes, a woman came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm very happy to be taking this course because I want to learn how to make baby food. Because I don't want to feed my baby the stuff they sell in the store." And when she said those words to me, it was like somebody hit me on the head with a sledgehammer. I never even thought of such a thing. I mean, my wife and I, we had kids, we fed them stuff they had in the store. But this woman was conscious enough and sensitive enough and sensible enough to make a determination that that stuff was unclean or impure, or in her opinion, harmful to her baby. And she was going to protect the baby by growing a garden herself and feeding the baby only the clean stuff that she grew in her garden. Which, as I say, for me, it was an astonishing experience. But some people, some people are more concerned about things than other people. Okay, we've got 20 minutes left, which should have been taken up by the film, but I have some other ideas that I think you people will find helpful.
I do have a question.
Oh, let's take some questions.
So Sean asked, do you use a mulch on your garden to retain water or suppress weeds?
Both. I use a mulch, primarily peat moss, to retain water and to suppress weeds. But in my garden, this doesn't apply to anybody here, but in my garden, I didn't have a weed problem because I had developed a specific technique which prevented the weeds from growing. And it was not a chemical technique. It was a sun blocking technique. There's something similar commonly used in gardens, which is that black plastic. And you make holes in the black plastic and you put the plant in the hole, and wherever the black plastic is, the weeds can't grow. So that's a common way that that people avoid weeds in the garden, and mulch the ground without using pesticides or poisons. I did the same thing. Do I use a mulch on your garden to retain water or suppress weeds? The answer is yes. I used a specific mulch that I developed myself, and it did both suppress weeds and retain moisture. It was totally effective, and I didn't weed my garden. I didn't have to. Weeds didn't grow.
Does anyone else have any questions? Now is a good time to ask them, so feel free to put your questions in the chat and I'll read them. Lynette wants to know, do you water over or under mulch?
Over. The only time I water under mulch is if I lay down a soaker hose and then I throw mulch on the garden on top of it, and the soaker hose ends up getting buried, not by my design, but just by what happens when I mulch. I just leave it like that. And otherwise, I water right on top of the mulch.
Okay, I don't see any other questions for now.
I want to make sure that I've covered garden techniques. Oh,
We have another one.
I've got a question for you guys, but I'll take your questions first.
Okay. Patricia's asking, do you ever use white clover as cover crop? Ooh, we're getting a lot of questions now.
I never use clover of any kind for anything in my garden because it is an obnoxious, persistent weed that makes me go crazy. So I just avoid it. It's a good fertilizer for the garden, but I don't use it, and it attracts bees and stuff like that. It's got its advantages, but I don't put it in the garden just because it has negative effects, which I'm not willing to put up with. I have all other tools I can use. I don't need it.
Ruth is wondering, is using cut grass on the garden an effective way to stop weeds from growing?
I don't understand that question.
If you like mow your lawn and use the
Oh, the grass
Grass
clippings?
clippings,
Perfect.
yeah.
That's a beautiful mulch. Sure, as long as you don't put chemicals on the lawn. Because if you want to have an organic garden, which is the only sensible thing to do, you take the poison off your lawn and you put it in your garden. What's going on here? So if you don't use poisons on your grass and you take those grass clippings, they are an ideal garden mulch.
John is wondering, is there a predator insect that would protect my wife's roses?
John, I just read something about rose plants being friendly with Clematis, which is a flower. And I honestly don't remember all the details. So protect your wife's roses. I think the Clematis have some kind of a beneficial effect along that line. I'm not a rose grower, I'm not a flower grower really, but I did come across something that might make the answer to your question yes. What I would suggest to you is try looking up roses and Clematis as companions. It was a very effective article. I saved it. As a matter of fact, I was going to give it to the group, and I will next week. But I think there is a predator that will help anyway to protect the roses. Clematis flower. Oh, I also think basil is a rose protector. I think there's something about basil that makes the roses less attractive to pests. So Clematis flowers and basil might help protect your wife's roses.
Is there like a bug that would help as well? Like a
Not to my knowledge.
No. Okay.
I honestly can't say that I know that.
Nicole we have a couple people asking where your book is for sale. It is for sale at the library right now. You can just go up to the main desk and ask for it. We have copies available. They're $25 per book, and it's cash or check only, please. But again, that's available anytime at the front desk during library hours. Just ask for Vince's book and we will get you a copy.
The book is sold in the stores for $30, but as a consideration for the library and the work it does, I'm making it available for $25. And I'm not going to blow my own horn. You make your own judgments.
We also have it in our collection too, so if anyone wants to rent it before buying it, you can check it out too from the library. Okay, do we have any other questions at this time? Okay, Vince, the floor is yours for about another 10 minutes.
Okay,
if you have
good.
anything else to
Good.
say.
I wanted to give me a minute here. I've got to. Okay. Contained in everything I've been saying so far is life in the soil. And that is key. Most of the life in the soil is invisible. And that's why people don't appreciate it and don't even realize it's there, because you can't see these microbes. And that's what's mostly the life in the soil. There are the insects that we're all familiar with, the worms and the larvae and stuff like that. But the key to growing a successful garden is having the life in the soil in your consciousness and realizing what you need to do as a plantsman, as a gardener. What you need to do is you need to take care of that life in the soil, because that's what's making everything else happen. And been trying to giving you techniques for taking care of the life in the soil. And I keep insisting on soil amendments, because the soil amendments create the food supply for the life in the soil. And then, they can do their thing in the case of the mycorrhizobial fungi. They're parasites. The mycorrhizobial fungi are alive in the soil, but they cannot live. They cannot support their own life. The only way they can live is by attaching themselves to the roots of plants, because the plant will give them nourishment that they need to survive. And in return, the mycorrhizobial fungi have smaller feelers, roots going out, than the plants have. So the mycorrhizobial fungi tentacles can reach more food than the plant could reach without them. And it brings that extra food back to the roots of the plant and feeds the plant with it. So it's a symbiotic relationship. And the key to successful gardening is understanding that the soil is alive, and you got to take care of the living critters in the soil so they can feed your plants and take care of your plants. And then you can get jazzy, like I said. You can get other kind of predators that will kill the bugs, and you can do companion planting that will automatically eliminate certain pests, and all of those garden techniques. You might think of them as sophisticated garden techniques, but they should really be basic garden techniques, because they're fundamental to make the whole process work well. The living soil supports plant life in many ways. Oh, I didn't get involved in the geology part, but the living soil, the life organisms in the soil, take carbon out of the atmosphere. Carbon comes out of the atmosphere by the plants absorbing it through their leaves and then passing it down through the roots, sending it into the soil. And the soil life contributes to that process. So vegetation is, in a very real sense, an air filtration system to reduce the amount of carbon in the air. That's why forests are so important in the globe. Forests are gigantic carbon sinks. They suck astounding amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere. And unfortunately, there's a campaign now in some places like Brazil and so forth to cut down forests. But all plants remove carbon from the atmosphere, so that's something else that they do and why we need them. Also, plants hold water in the soil, and soil living organisms keep water in the soil. So the living soil nourishes plants, minimizes runoff, minimizes flooding, and meets garden requirements. I wish you could ask. Anybody want to ask questions about compost? Because that's cool. That's free and it's really effective. So I'd like to talk with you about compost if anybody wants to raise some issues. The idea is kitchen scraps plus soil minerals, 4 inches of plant scrap. I don't mean kitchen scraps, I mean plant scraps, including weeds and everything else. Plant scraps plus minerals like biochar, like manure, like compost, brown leaves that come down in the fall, all of that stuff, mix them together, and you get compost, whose purpose is to feed the organisms that are living in the soil.
Okay, Nicole is asking, do you take the seeds out of vegetables that you use from the kitchen scraps for compost?
No, I leave them in. What happens is composting, that process that we call composting, it is a process that naturally generates heat. If you put your hand into the middle of a functioning compost pile, you can't keep it there too long because it will get burned. It's too hot. In that compost, it's a heat activity which will kill off all the seeds and many of the insects and other organisms that are undesirable for the garden. So the answer is no, I do not take the seeds out.
Holly said, when I was a child, oops, oh no, my stuff went away. Sorry, people. When I was a child, we did a school project on compost. Are scraps like coffee, eggshells, veggie scraps still acceptable additives to the compost?
All of the above, definitely yes. Eggshells, coffee, tea, all acceptable. The things that I could isolate things that are not acceptable. Meat, dog and cat manure, even human manure. Don't take the baby's diapers and throw them in the compost pile. Meat is what brings rats and critters to your compost, so you don't want to do that. Cooked foods, don't put them in the compost pile. Weeds that spread, I told you the perennial weeds that spread with horizontal runners, 3 or 4 white horizontal runners, don't put those in because the heat of the compost process will not kill those plants. And when you put that compost in your garden, those plants will revitalize and they'll become difficult to remove weeds in your garden.
Ruth is wondering, is compost tea made from direct kitchen scraps?
No, compost tea is made from direct compost. You've got to take the kitchen scraps and you have to compost them. The kitchen scraps have to go through the composting process and change from kitchen scraps into compost. Then the compost is what you use to make the compost tea.
Okay. And Patricia is asking, have you ever heard of simply putting dry leaves into a covered trash container and leaving it over the winter and it creating usable compost?
It will do something like that, but not too effectively because it's incomplete. Your compost is the wrong word to use because if you have only the leaves, yes, they will decompose, but they will not decompose into compost without the other compost ingredients. That's exactly, by the way, what happens on the forest floor. The leaves fall off of the trees and they lay on the ground in the forest. They never become compost, but they do all deteriorate and enrich the soil ultimately, but not compost.
And then John said that Coast of Maine makes a prepared compost. Is that okay to use when you don't have your compost pile started?
Yes, definitely. Compost Maine, most of their products are very good. They also have other combination products, and the compost that they sell is fine. And most of the other commercial compost is legitimate also.
Okay, does anyone else have any other questions? We have a couple more minutes and then we're gonna wrap things up. Oh, James is asking how much compost is recommended per square foot of garden?
I'm not trying to be funny or a wise guy. You can't put too much compost. Put as much as you want and incorporate it in with the rototiller or with the pitchfork. I guess the closest I could come to a direct answer is the more the better.
Nicole asked if you would be able to sign a book for us to buy, and I believe you pre-signed them, correct?
No, I haven't,
No, you
but I
haven't.
will be glad to do that. I will go downstairs and I will sign some books. And if that's important to you, I would be very proud to sign the book that I know you will be very, very happy with.
Okay, do we have any other questions? We are just about out of time. Okay, nope, no other questions. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. Just a reminder that there is one more class. If you haven't signed up for it yet, be sure to sign up for it, because just because you sign up for one class doesn't mean you're signed up for all of them. You do sign up for each class individually. There is also a survey that will pop up once we end this, and if you wouldn't mind just filling out the survey, letting Vince know how we did and what kind of programs you'd like in the future at the library, we'd really appreciate that. But in the meantime, have a good night, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much. Next week, we're going to be talking a lot more about organic agriculture and other techniques. I think you're going to find the class very informative.
Okay, good night.